Are you happy to use the percentages?
Yeah.
Just more fun that way.
You're such a fucking nerd.
What?
Percentages are more fun.
Percentages are more fun. People...
Welcome to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Liam, and we're both lecturers in IADT in psychology and cyber psychology.
We are.
So, Nicola, what are you in bits about today?
I am in bits about trolling and harassment, and I'm pretty sure that I am not the only person who's in bits about experiencing trolling and harassment. I think there's quite a lot of people out there who are.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic we need to... Spoiler alert in terms of like sensitive content.
Yeah. I think coming from the online dating episode, we talked a bit about some of the experiences of people and what kind of harassment they come across, whether it's persistent contact or being called like names or slurs or physical threats and so on. I thought it was kind of useful to look at like how prevalent this is outside of the online dating space and why it happens and who does it.
Like, we have some interesting research we've done here that we can talk about as well, in terms of celebrities and the type of harassment they face and how they respond. I definitely think the cyber harassment, if we talk about it generally, is obviously the most pervasive form of online abuse. And it's not just like, hey, I'm going to like troll you or do something that's negative towards you, but actually using a number of methods, knowing that you're on a number of platforms and identifying exactly where I can target you depending on time of day as well.
Yeah.
This creates this inescapable feeling.
Yeah. So there's loads of kinds of cyber harassment, right? Including things like cyberbullying and cyberstalking and image-based sexual abuse and catfishing and all that kind of stuff. And we'll talk about some of those definitely again. Probably some of them will have their own episode. So this episode turned into 2 episodes instead of 1 because this seems to be a running theme. When it becomes my episodes, I like to talk a lot. And so this ended up being quite long, so we had to make it 2 episodes. There's a lot to say about trolling. There's just a lot of it online. So what happened is our first episode is looking about trolling more generally and how it affects people, whereas our second episode is looking at why it happens, who are the trolls, and what can we do about it. We need some content warnings, obviously, for trolling because trolls are not the nicest people. We will be discussing sexual harassment, mentions of suicide, obviously psychological distress, and some specific case studies. So particularly around women online and different people in the public eye, the Madeleine McCann case, and so on. So if you feel like this episode is not for you right now, that's okay. Please feel free to skip it. Or we will put some mental health support services that are available online into our show notes. So please check those if you feel in need of them.
Yeah, sounds good. Content warning done. Take.
Yes.
I think it's easy to downplay the content warnings when you hear them when we talk about a lot of the upsetting content, but I think if it's a trolling experience, negative experience online, kind of build your resilience towards it, seek some mental health supports, but also just build up that barrier and build up a wall to whatever the communication is as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose we should start with what is trolling, right? Because there are actually quite a lot of ways of thinking about trolling. So what's your understanding of it?
So the typical or classic forms of trolling I think of are, I was actually discussing this with students recently, the kind of someone contacts you in an online space, whether it's to seek support or help. So there's a very famous one from a number of years ago where someone asks a person online to create a missing cat poster. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No.
Oh my God, I love that.
Immediately going to Google.
They weren't sure whether this was actually real or not. So whether it was a staged form of trolling. I would like to think it's a staged format of trolling. I think it's a bit too nuanced and has taken quite a bit of time, but that they're characteristics of trolling anyway, where the person invests a lot of time to create and specifically target or create upset or harm. But basically this woman asks someone to create a missing cat poster for them because they're just terrible at photoshopping skills, and these are the to be printed. So they create this missing cat poster. They put in like an offer of a reward, even though the person says they didn't have the money for a reward, and then they make it into like the response is no reward underneath the cat's photograph. And they just keep going back like this. They change the cat when he says that he thinks the cat that he's picked is cuter than her cat, and it just ensues where Eventually, she's not happy about it. There's like they use like the lost background for like the missing cat poster. They like make missing pieces. She talks about how this is upsetting her, and he puts in like movie quotes about it. It just goes on, and then she eventually just says she doesn't want anything. But it's back and forth by email, and it's looking at the language that she's using. So he's not actually doing anything that she's not asking for. She's just not being specific enough, and he's being reading between the lines.
Yeah.
Very different to like harassment-based trolling. So this is like kudos trolling, like for the fun or the lols kind of trolling that it's seen as within that community. It's not identifying something that's significantly going to cause harm. Whereas like I identify that person is upset about or potentially might be upset about their body image. I then pick a series of comments that is going to upset that person or a particular community, and it's pervasive and continues until the community potentially shuts down in some of the examples that we see online.
Yeah, exactly. So that covers, I suppose, trolling is like a spectrum. So you've got that first example, which is something I've come across, not that specific example, which is brilliant,
it's
frankly.
Really
but it's called Photoshop trolling.
Yeah.
And I kind of get, like, it's mostly done just for amusement and not to harm anybody. And there's some brilliant examples. If you want to Google them, they're really funny.
Great Facebook pages for that. Yeah.
And it's also, you're asking someone to do work for free a lot of the time. And so if they sort of gently troll you by misinterpreting what you asked for, then I think that's kind of okay. And it is done for people's amusement and it's not harmful. So that's like the very gentle end of the trolling spectrum, which is done for fun. And then there is a range. So you talked about that persistent kind of disruptive contact, or like verging on harassment, very negative comments, taking over communities and so on. So that's towards the other end of the spectrum. And then you've got the very far end of the spectrum, which is attack trolls, and they are specifically looking to cause misery for their victims.
Yeah.
And they will often target specific people, as well as specific communities, but often specific people, like specific individuals.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk quite a bit about that today, but we're also going to talk about like how other people can get caught up in that as well. So like the kind of definition of trolling is a really specific type of malicious online behavior. So it's intended to aggravate, to annoy, to disrupt online interactions and communication. That deliberate part of it is important because people can get caught up in arguments online that's more spontaneous and more like short-temperedness. Trolling is purposeful, it's antagonistic, and so it's quite a specific thing. So there's been quite a lot of cases, like very high-profile cases. There's been so many high-profile cases. I had to just pick and choose a few here. I went looking for trolling cases, and literally anyone in the public eye who is ever interviewed talks about how they've been trolled and harassed online. But in Ireland, we had a case a few years ago now. So this person trolled 6 women who were journalists between 2012 and 2018. And in 2019, he was jailed. So 6 years, just a barrage, constant barrage of abusive messages, as well as things like photographs. So they didn't know where he was, if he was following them, and so on. The photographs were actually after he had gone to court and been set bail and released on bail. So he had photographed them in the courthouse. He hadn't actually left his house very much before that. He was someone who was kind of locked in at home.
So he photographed them in the courthouse while so he got someone else to photograph them on his behalf? Or
it was when he was there in the courthouse. So he wasn't supposed to be contacting them. One of the conditions of his bail was no contact with them, and he was still harassing them while he was on bail. And when the police searched his house, they took his laptop and didn't find anything, but then they found a phone concealed under the floorboards, and that was what he had been using.
Okay.
So when he was eventually sentenced, he eventually got a 5-year sentence, 3 years in jail, 2 years suspended, and has not contacted any of them since then, thankfully. So Aoife Barry, who was one of the journalists involved in that, was kind enough to speak to us about her experience and how it kind of influenced her ability to be online and the way that she manages her online presence after that.
Hi, my name is Aoife Barry. I'm a journalist and author, and I wrote the book Social Capital. And in the book, I wrote about my own experience of trolling, and I also spoke to people who had been trolled on a long-term basis or on maybe even a one-off basis, and about how they dealt with that. And my thoughts really about trolling and the impact on people is that, first of all, people can be really unsure about whether to acknowledge what's happening and even to call it trolling or toxic behaviour that's directed towards them. Sometimes that can just be because they don't know who the person is and they don't know if the person is trying to have a joke at their expense. It can also be because they don't want to give that person power over them or to make that person kind of determine how they're feeling about themselves. And it can also be really hard to talk to other people about it and to say, look, I don't really like these messages that I'm getting. I think, this person is trying to target me in some way. That's not an easy conversation for people to have. There's also a big gap between, wanting something done and what can be done, because even if people block people or mute them on social media or even report them to the platform, there might not be anything that can particularly be done. They might, actually not be able to see further trolling that's happening because the person has been blocked. So the person might feel really helpless about what's going on. In my case, it was mainly harassment over email by one person, and I was one of 5 people who were involved in a case that was taken against the man, and he was found guilty of harassment and was subsequently jailed for a number of years. And that doesn't mean that what happened there, even though there was an outcome to it that, meant that the person was legally prevented from harassing us further online, didn't mean that that was necessarily an outcome that everybody expected or that should be the outcome for all of these cases. And I think it shows that there is a lot of work still to be done in terms of, what needs to be done to tackle harassment from a victim's point of view. In our case, we were taken really seriously by the Gardaí, but I can imagine that some people might be afraid to go to report what's happening to them because while we were in a group of people, other people might be on their own. They might be afraid it might cost them money, and they might be afraid that because the person is anonymous, there's nothing that can be done. So there's a lot of factors that can go towards actually tackling trolling. In terms of the impact on myself and my own online behaviour, I think when you know that somebody's been paying very close attention to you, you then in future pay close attention to what you do and don't want to say about yourself and your personal life and where you are at a particular time and what you're doing. I try as best I can to not put a lot of information online about where I am at a specific time, whether that's, if I'm in Ireland or abroad. I try not to say where I live. People know I live in Dublin, but I try not to say specifically where in the city that I live. And I definitely pulled back a lot on what I say on certain platforms. I don't really use the main platform where that person was following me as much, and I certainly don't say anything personal on it. And I, use things like the green stories on Instagram to make sure that stuff that I do put on that I only want certain people to see is in a certain place. So, other people I talked to would have said that trolling really had a massive impact on how safe they felt online and, and how much information they're willing to put out there. And actually, in some cases, really ruined a positive relationship that they had with the internet because they felt that they could no longer express themselves the way that they wanted to. I think trolling can be really multifaceted. It can involve, one person, it can involve groups of people. I don't think we're any better necessarily at dealing with it, but there are more kind of legal avenues that people can follow. That's not always what people actually want to do. And I think the key is trying to figure out a way forward and tackling bad and toxic behaviour online, and also keeping in mind that it can have a really, negative impact on people's internet relationships going forward.
I mean, it's kind of understandable how someone is going to feel if, imagine I decided to use you as a trolling victim or a cyber harassment victim. I decide to target you in all the spaces or platforms I know that you use, the place where you express yourself, where you seek support, like we were talking about in a previous episode, where I look for information, connect with others, and I basically tainted those spaces. And there is no let up for that person. It is a completely overwhelming experience.
Yeah. And the other thing was this particular troll was posting as them in spaces and damaging their reputation. So they had people contacting them to say, I saw you in this space saying this, what the hell's going on?
So and it wasn't them.
Impersonation, which can be a part of trolling as well, and cyber stalking and stuff like that as well. So yeah, not great, but it's one of the first prosecutions of someone for trolling in Ireland, which I think is interesting. It was 6 people, 6 years, intense for that long. So that was quite a serious case. So Aoife Barry wrote an excellent book called Social Capital, all about the online world. Really, really good. You should definitely check that out. Her story also reminds me of a new documentary that's out on BBC Sounds at the moment called Stalked, about a woman's experience of being stalked. And it's very similar to a lot of what we heard Aoife talk about there. So definitely check that out if you're interested in this kind of thing. In the UK, one of the first cases I could find was an internet troll who was jailed after mocking the deaths of teenagers and mocking their memorial pages on Facebook and the families. You might have heard about that one, yeah. So this guy, I'm not going to name the trolls.
Yeah.
I don't think
That's part of the kudos trolling, naming.
Exactly, yeah.
I would avoid that. Yeah.
So this person targeted, like I said, the Facebook tribute pages of teenagers who died, including like a young woman who was only 15 who'd been hit by a train. And he like defaced photographs and posted them. He created YouTube videos, all sorts of things, taunting the victims and the families of the victims. He was sentenced to 18 weeks in jail and a 5-year order banning him from creating and accessing any social media. So again, we see a jail sentence for something that's really quite extreme in terms of trolling.
I don't think this. Yeah, I think the sentencing doesn't match the potential impact in that particular one.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But I suppose they're still working out what appropriate sentencing is for these kinds of crimes. One thing in common across these examples that I have is that the perpetrators of the trolling attacks had really serious mental health issues. This was someone who was self-described as having Asperger's and also being quite depressed, staying at home all the time, drinking and so on. So it wasn't someone who had a healthy social life and so on. The same with the first person in the Irish case. He hadn't left his house, I think twice. He'd left his house in 17 years. And was very depressed and drinking and so on. That's a commonality. The next case I'm going to talk about, which I'll also discuss a little bit later, is a woman called Brenda Leyland in the UK, who was part of a large group of people who were very actively and viciously trolling Madeleine McCann's parents on Twitter specifically. And there was a journalist doing an investigation of this, and he approached her and said that they had evidence that it was her doing it. She denied it and then took her own life a few days later.
But was she an actual troll?
She was. However, I'm going to talk about this research a little later. She didn't identify as a troll. She identified as like an investigator. So it was kind of into the conspiracy theories around the fact that the
citizen journalism kind of style.
Kind of. Now, it turns out she was someone, again, with very serious mental health problems, borderline personality disorder, had very little relationship with the truth. She always told fantastical stories throughout her life about all sorts of things. And so when she was asked to put her profession down, she said investigator or journalist, but she wasn't. She just considered herself to be
So there's significant disassociation from, which is a trend in the other two cases as well, like isolation and then reading into the wider environment scenario and kind of reality is getting lost very fast here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to come back to that story about the McCanns and the trolls that targeted them. We'll come back to that in the second episode and we'll talk a bit more about the research on that there. So if you don't know what the Madeleine McCann case is, though, the McCann's 3-year-old daughter, Madeleine, was taken while they were on holidays in Portugal. So they left herself and her siblings alone in an unlocked apartment while they had dinner nearby in a restaurant. And it was one of the most widely reported child abduction cases in history. So the coverage was comparable to when Princess Diana died, if you imagine that sort of blanket, saturated coverage. And there were a lot of conspiracies and theories about the fact that the McCanns had killed the child herself, whereas it's really widely believed by the police now that she was abducted. So yeah, she had sent hundreds of hateful tweets and caught up in the conspiracy theories about the case. But I'll talk about the psychology and how that looked in that community online in a little bit. So these are like really egregious cases that have made it to the courts or very much in the public eye. And like I said, there's similarities among the perpetrators in that they suffered from serious mental health issues. But is that the case for all trolls is the question, because trolling is so prevalent. It's like, are there that many people out there with serious mental health issues all trolling people all the time? Of course they're not.
No.
So we look at some of the research around how and why people are doing this, what kind of people do this, can anyone do it, and so on. But lots of people in the public eye in particular have spoken out about the kind of abuse and trolling and harassment that they get online, to the point where it seems to just be part and parcel of being in the public eye in any way. You just get this barrage of absolute hate online. Women talk about it a lot, but also there's lots of examples of men talking about it. Like Barry Keoghan was talking about how damaging it has been. The online trolls have been targeting him over his parenting. He doesn't really talk about his kid online. So he's a young boy. Because they keep targeting him about being a deadbeat dad and an absent father, they also target him over his image, and he finds it really distressing and disturbing.
Just before filming or during the filming of Saltburn, when he was really starting to get a lot more international acclaim. He started to do a complete wipe of his social media. There was lots of people talking about when he wiped his Instagram, and even now when, like, I follow Barry Keoghan, and when he does post content, he doesn't post the surroundings that he's in. He is very conscious to try and like do delayed posting. He doesn't post his full face. Sometimes he will obstruct those images. So I think there is a strategy in place there as well. And he doesn't post any content of his own kids. I know he posted just the other day, he posted with Chris Hemsworth and one of Chris Hemsworth's kids. Chris Hemsworth posts quite a lot of content with his own family, and so I think there are norms and values that he has for himself that he can see in another parent. Same like when you're in a standard mates. Yeah.
In this particular interview in The Guardian, he talked particularly about reducing the amount, like not putting his kid online at all because of the kind of hateful messaging he's been getting. He said it's quite disturbing, the kind of messaging he's getting.
He's definitely restricted his own presence, certainly.
Yeah, I understand why. It happens a lot to like so many people. Just the other day, a female astronaut, Emily Calandrelli, she was the 100th woman to go into space. And when they got up into space and she was in free fall and she was looking at Earth from space, she was super excited, like really just overawed by the whole experience, and was talking about how amazing it was on video. And she was there with Blue Origin. They were the ones who'd sent her into space. They posted this video of her. And there was so much toxicity and hateful comments and sexist comments and objectifying comments that they actually had to take the video down. This is someone experiencing something incredibly beautiful and they had to take the video down. Loads of examples in sport, like a lot of footballers have had horrific racist abuse. A lot of Olympians, I mean, really high profile example recently was the Algerian boxer, Iman Khalif, who just suffered such an intense amount of abuse and transphobia, even though she is not trans, during the Olympics during the summer, including from people like Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling, who have huge numbers of followers and like really amplified the attacks on social media for her, like brought a lot of their followers in to completely dogpile her.
But J.K. Rowling commented on her, and one of her opponents that J.K. Rowling was commenting about actually then came out in support, and just refuted it. And it was just like, yes, this is what needs to happen in like our cyberspace, and you just need to calm down and stay away, and use your public voice a little bit less.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly when it's nonsense that you're saying. Iman has filed a legal complaint in France for online harassment. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens, because obviously Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling, well, no one's specifically named in it.
Okay.
But it's for online harassment in general, because that's where she was when it happened, and they have a law for that. But the key harassers like J.K. Rowling and Elon Musk weren't actually in France. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that.
Another one that stands out to me is Gareth Thomas. So he was the Welsh rugby captain for quite some time. He came out, received a significant amount of trolling in association with that, and then also shared his HIV status and received a massive amount of trolling connected to that, which was actually just essentially embedded in homophobia, and received a huge amount of comments. He's done a number of interviews about that trolling and the online hate that he received. It had a significant negative impact on him. The thing I'm trying to point to here is no matter whether you are a parent who has lost a child, you are a journalist, you are a sports person, whoever you are, this can have a significant impact on your mental health and that invasion into your digital space and life.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the kind of trolling that happens is like so virulent and obsessive and dark, like the kinds of things that people are saying to each other online is just horrific. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So how prevalent is it? Who does it happen to? And we've talked quite a bit about people in the public eye, which it's extremely common with. But it's also quite common in the general public. So in the US, there was a Pew Research report in 2021 that said that 41% of US adults had personally experienced some kind of online harassment, and 25% have experienced more severe harassment, such as trolling and so on. So that's a substantial number of people. In Ireland, the DCU Anti-Bullying Centre in 2023 completed a study, and they found that just under half of respondents had at one point experienced some sort of online hate. So about 45% of them, particularly around things about their personal identity or beliefs. So examples like race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, etc.
Any form of difference.
Yeah, exactly. And younger people were much more likely to have experienced this compared to people, say, over 35. There were some gender differences in the Irish data. Women much more likely to receive online hate targeting their gender than men. Men were more likely to receive online hate about their age, which I think is quite interesting, and I wouldn't have expected that. And men were also more likely to be targeted because of their nationality than women. And I think some of that comes from, there's a prevalent discussion around kind of immigrants and migrants and asylum seekers that it's sexual predators coming to Ireland to take our women and to rape our women and stuff. There's just horrific discourse. So I would imagine some of that comes potentially from that kind of discourse. In the UK, there was a report called the Impact of Online Abuse Hearing Victims' Voice Report in 2022. And they found that 45% of people had experienced online harassment and 36% had experienced trolling. So again, this is kind of lifetime numbers rather than in the last several months. There was a French study that found much, much lower percentages, but it was in the last 12 months. So it was like 8% in the last 12 months, whereas this is over a lifetime. So this is a significant problem. A lot of people are experiencing this kind of behaviour, and particularly young people because they're online more than older people. But it is also hugely a problem, like we said, for people in the public eye. So we have a couple of examples. We heard from Aoife Barry earlier, but Aoife Moore, who is a journalist, has spoken openly about her experiences of being harassed and trolled. In fact, she created a whole podcast series called Trolled on the experience of trolling. And particularly that series covered like gossip sites, which I'm not going to mention because I don't want to drive traffic to them because they're horrific, which are literally just sites where people have a thread or several threads for a particular celebrity and pull apart every single little bit of their life.
But there's like thousands of comments in some of these. We've looked at quite a few of these. There are thousands of comments, and they start at a sensationalist or a just generally incorrect claim, and then they move further and further and further away from what is actually the case in reality, and speculation is just rampant then as a result of it.
So, for example, like a female television presenter will post about having a glass of wine with her friends at the weekend, and within 10 comments, people are calling her a raging alcoholic. Like, it's actually just obscene. We're going to hear more from Aoife in episode 2, and we'll talk more about those gossip sites there, and we'll discuss some of the research on those because there is some research on that kind of behaviour online. So there's been some research on people in the public eye, and in particular politics. So there was one really interesting study in 2019 from Akhtar and Morrison looking at trolling on members of the UK Parliament. So they had 181 MPs taking part. They had all been trolled, right? The highest amount of trolling, unsurprisingly, was on Twitter, and that was pre-Elon Musk. So you can imagine what it's like now. What is, I think, really interesting about this is that women get a lot more varied kinds of abuse than men. So different kinds of trolling and harassment. In all of the cases where the gender of the person was known who was doing the harassing, nearly 94% of those were men. So it is common in a lot of the studies that we see that trolls are more likely to be men, but we will talk about some exceptions to that as well. Men reported in this study more concern about their reputational damage. So that was things like being accused of lying or having ulterior motives for doing something or not being good at their job. Whereas women had much more concern about their personal safety. So they were getting death threats and rape threats and threats to their family. They were bringing in more security guards, changing their routes to work, changing their routines.
I was going to ask, is the content, is that not due to gender? Is that due to the type of trolling? Men being accused. So like if you look at like Matt Hancock and all of the hate and abuse that he receives, a lot of that is actually in relation to his policies and his decisions and his his character later on. Whereas some of the trolling I've seen against female MPs is very much related to gender, their identity, sexuality, and race.
Yeah.
And it's not about their decisions or their behaviour. It's about their identity.
Although that is true, yes, but also it happens more to women who speak up about things. So if you speak up about abortion rights, women's rights, feminism, sexist behaviour, misogyny, any kind of controversial things at all, it doesn't have to be related to women, anything controversial, you are more likely to get this kind of abuse as well.
Okay. So just by putting yourself out there as having an opinion, not necessarily a different or a negative opinion, just an opinion, and it is being associated with gender.
Yes.
Okay, so that gives you an insight into kind of manospheric-based content, potentially. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's why, like, in the Irish general election, a lot of politicians came out to say that we need more women in politics, but also they understand why women don't get into politics, because the amount of abuse and harassment they receive, both in person and online, but particularly online, is just horrific. And so a lot have said that they would find it hard to recommend to other women to get into politics because this is the kind of stuff that they have to deal with. So the psychological consequences for this particular study in the UK was, there was psychological distress among a lot of the participants, but the women felt much more distressed than men. Obviously, if your family is being threatened, that is very, very different to your reputation being threatened. And both are distressing, but...
Your reputation doesn't need a security guard to make it feel protected.
Exactly, yeah. In the general public, then, there's been quite a bit of research in gaming because a lot of gaming platforms and a lot of games are known for being places where a lot of trolling happens and a lot of harassment and racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, the whole spectrum of loveliness that happens online. And so there's been a few studies looking at this and found that it's like widespread, both general harassment and sexual harassment against women in particular in these spaces. And the kind of coping strategies that women use are to pretend to be male, so use an avatar or a screen name or a username rather that's male or neutral to pretend that they're not a woman so that they don't get that abuse. And the differences in experiences that women have playing as a woman and playing as a man or neutral are very, very far apart from each other all of the time. They'll also avoid communicating with other players so the other players can't hear their voice and don't know that they're a woman. They'll often seek help from other people that they know, friends inside the game or outside the game, because it can be quite intense and quite a lot. It predicts, both general and sexual harassment predicts women withdrawing from the games and rumination. So thinking in a circular way about it without kind of any resolve can be quite distracting and kind of lead people down a dark path. But it's mediated by how responsive the gaming organization is. So if they report this kind of harassment and the gaming company responds well and bans players or blocks players or does something to help, they are less likely to withdraw from the game. But if the organization doesn't do anything, they're more likely to withdraw. So
you feel completely alone. But like the most not prevalent necessarily tactic in terms of like actually effectiveness, so avoiding communication with other players, so avoiding actually almost like outing yourself for your gender or your sexuality in that gaming space. A lot of female players or LGBT players in the research don't actually speak and use the full functionality of some of those platforms because of a fear of harassment or conflict or being targeted by someone else. But that's really interesting that before they even get into that space or when they're in it, because it's so well known, they don't actually speak and they're withdrawn from that space, which is really, it's a bit sad, to be honest, that they can't get the full experience and that positive gaming community that kind of is what gaming in a collaborative and community space is all about in terms of the rewards that you get.
Yeah, I was just going to say that is the benefit of gaming, right? Is that community and social aspect. And they're cutting themselves off from that completely for very understandable reasons. Now, it's not every game, but some games are well known for it. Yeah,
unfortunately. Yeah.
I know in IEDT you were involved. Were you involved?
Yes.
Yes, you were. In some research. Of course you were, yes.
I'm involved in all of the research.
Yeah, exactly.
So we had a research project here in IEDT as part of the cyber psychology program. This researcher was Denise Dunn. She was supervised by Hannah Barton, and I was involved in the project because of stats nerdness and supporting the research methods of it. I'm sorry, okay? Basically, from a high level, the study was actually looking at the types and levels of cyber harassment that celebrities here in Ireland were receiving across social media, and really interestingly, the potential relationships between the celebrity themselves and their likelihood to experience harassment. So that we actually looked at their self-efficacy and their personality traits, so particularly extroversion. And the cyber harassment levels to see where there are relationships and differences across those.
So for anyone who doesn't know, what's self-efficacy?
Self-efficacy is your knowledge, confidence and skills in yourself.
Cool.
Okay. It's very highly related to other personal psychological concepts like self-esteem. Okay. So it's very much about how you view yourself in those skills. It's a very widely researched area within psychology. So the research study was a mixed methods approach. So we did a survey, so a quantitative survey, and we did interviews with a series of celebrities. So we actually used 134 celebrities, which was actually, it might seem small, but that is a really high number of celebrities
for the Irish population.
In an Irish population.
Yeah.
So in terms of the actual people who were involved, so half of that sample were male. So 50% were male, 47% were female. There was one non-binary participant, and there were other participants who didn't want to disclose their gender for the study in case they were potentially identifiable, which was quite interesting. Yeah. All over the age of 18, about 30 years old was the average age. And these were composed of areas of broadcasting, media personalities was the most predominant one. And then some of the areas we've spoken about so far. So like journalists, influencers, entrepreneurs, CEOs, actors, actresses, writers, authors, comedians, musicians, stylists, celebrity chefs, all of those types of participant. So it was actually quite a nice diverse sample. And 50% of that sample had been in the public media eye for 10 years or more.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this is not a small or limited sample by that comparison.
Yeah, they're not people getting their 15 minutes of fame.
No, they're absolutely not. Now, in terms of the tactics they use, so I'll talk about the tactics. So the predominant forms of cyber harassment and where it was taking place. You already spoiled it earlier. It was actually Twitter. So yeah, no surprises or shocks there. Twitter was the platform with the most amount of cyber harassment on it. That was typically 98% of the sample had some form of interaction through Twitter that was negative. Now, in terms of the types of behaviour, so how do we respond to cyber harassment as a victim in that moment? Obviously, we've spoken about the overwhelming nature of it. Half the sample would block people, so 50% blocking people. Reporting it to the platform was the next greatest one. 20% trying to ignore any of that behaviour. 14% of them just simply deleted them. So these are people who have high resilience. They're in a public space. They can kind of not shrug off, but certainly have an ability to diffuse or deflect some of this behaviour. 7% contacted their solicitors, similar amount contacting the police to be involved. 4%, really small amount of those trying to fight back against that trolling behaviour, which I'm sure you'll have an opinion on in a second. 1% of participants left those platforms. Okay, so complete cut off and shut off from it. There was no significant relationships found between someone's self-efficacy and their likelihood to be experience cyber harassment. There was also no significant relationship between someone's personality trait of extroversion and their likelihood to experience cyber harassment. So extroversion was chosen because it is one of the more prevalent personality traits amongst celebrities generally within the research.
Gotcha.
So it was a common predictor, and there was a logic behind picking extroversion specifically. The quantitative research was less interesting. The qualitative was. So qualitative is that rich, deeper experience that we do look for. 99% of participants experienced cyber harassment out of that sample.
That doesn't really surprise me, I have to say.
86% of those received cyber harassment that was of an intimate or sexual nature.
Jesus.
Okay. So
and that's considering that it's a balanced sample for men and women. That does kind of surprise me, actually.
It is surprising. That's when you were talking earlier, I was like, I have research that contradicts this. Just whispering in the background of my head. But I think in terms of the diversity of the sample, how long those those celebrities have been in media for, they're in the public eye for quite some time. They're not a standard participant who experiences cyber harassment online or even in a gaming platform. But I think it shows that no one is infallible or less likely to be targeted. I think the concept of gender in this space is not necessarily as relevant. I think we have, certainly women do experience a lot of negative experiences online. We have spoken about that in quite a lot of detail. That doesn't mean that men also are not victimized.
Yeah.
So I think that is a particularly interesting study to
It
go and take a look at.
really is, particularly that gender aspect and the sexual content. That's fascinating to me because it hasn't really come up in a lot of other studies that I've seen. And so obviously there's more research needed in that area, I think. Another example is people in minority or more marginalized groups. So, for example, we know that trans people are much more likely to experience trolling and harassment online, particularly these days because the rise of anti-trans sentiment, particularly in the UK and the US, is fueled by public figures who have an inordinate amount of influence over the way that a lot of people think. We spoke to a friend of mine, Becky Cheadle, who is a trans woman and a brilliant comedian. Go see her. She's fantastic. About her experiences online.
Back in 2021, I incurred the ire of a community of anti-vaxxers on Twitter, and there was a big pile-on against me. It manifested itself as transphobia. They were angry at me for some vaccination stuff, but they came after me for being trans. It's just part of that whole far-right social media radicalization pipeline. Transphobia is just another one of the conspiracies that they buy into. I was able to get a bunch of the ringleaders permanently deleted from Twitter, and I felt really good about that. But then I found myself reaching for my phone in order to get annoyed by people like this. I went looking for confrontation, and I realized that's what these people are like. They're addicted to online conflict, and I don't think there's any winners in an online fight. And I didn't want to become that person. I didn't want to become like those people. That's not who I am, but it could easily have been what I became. So I thought it was better just to delete Twitter entirely.
We know a lot of people experience this, and so what are the effects on the victims of trolling? But these negative effects are similar to abuse offline, like very, very similar to if you were experiencing abuse offline. Things like anxiety, depression, fear, and anger. In severe cases, people can experience PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. People change their behavior both online and offline. So we talked about the MPs, the female MPs changing their routines, getting extra security. But people in real life also do that as well. Particularly if they're experiencing something like trolling and cyber stalking, where they feel like maybe the troll is watching what they're doing. But even in cases of trolling, they'll change their online behavior. They'll lock down their social media platforms, or they'll leave different platforms, or they will change their behavior, like we were talking about earlier, like posting less personal stuff, like Barry Keoghan. You know, those kinds of things. And so they're not able to use the platforms in the way that they would like and to fully express themselves online.
But that looks at how we view power in a digital space. So we talk about like cooperative power, where we seek support from someone else, or we report or block something for on the behalf of someone else. Coercive power is something that a troll can use. So changing that person's behavior, having that significant negative impact. Whereas the protective power that we can talk about from a theoretical perspective is the things that someone can do to either mitigate or remove those risks entirely. So it's that same paradigm that's used a lot in like cyberbullying research is still just as relevant here.
Yeah. In Aoife Moore's series on trolling, a lot of the people in the public eye that she spoke to ask other people to look at their comment sections and to look at those gossip sites and other places like that for them, to make sure that there's nothing kind of libelous or super problematic happening in that space, but they won't look at themselves. That's their way of protecting themselves from it. Because it is really distressing to see that many people. Like, we're not designed as humans to get this much feedback, full stop. Never mind negative feedback. And we have a negativity bias. We tend to focus on negative information more than positive information because, you know, if you think back from evolutionary perspective, negative information is information that maybe is a threat to us. And so we need to focus on that more than positive information to protect ourselves. But when you're looking at the comment section of a YouTube video that you've put up and there's 5,000 people and 1,000 of them are saying horrible things about you, that's not normal. Like, our brains weren't really developed in an evolutionary way to deal with that.
But you're also definitely not going to remember the positive comments
No,
amongst
God,
that
no.
minefield. But it like someone who is engaging and trolling, that motivation behind it, if it is to incite that upsetting mindset in that the person they're victimizing is, they're gaining power and control over
Yes.
them. They're making them feel victimized. The enjoyment, the motivation and the rationale for that behavior is coming from seeing the changes in behavior and the upset and the impact that it also does have, and seeing that person react in, say it's Twitter, and they're responding. Their troll is seeing that, seeing the impact of it and going, yes, perfect.
Yeah.
I'm getting what I want from this experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of that like minority of men who send dick pics, who send it for controlling reasons, to control the emotions of the person that they're sending it to like encourage them to feel despair or disgust or shame or those kinds of things. It's a similar kind of motivation. The same UK study I was talking about earlier, the Online Abuse Hearing the Victim's Voice report from 2022, looked at, you know, how people felt after being the victim of online abuse. The vast majority, like 86%, said it made them angry. A very similar number said made them anxious. A lot said it made them more distrustful of people, have difficulty sleeping, made me worried about my mental health. We're still up at like 67% here. Made me depressed, made me unable to concentrate, feel isolated. 60% said fear for their safety. So like, these are really horrendous experiences. So people wanting to withdraw from the world, from the online world, made me worry for my other family members, is 46%. These are very, very significant impacts on victims.
But between 50 and 70, or 50 and 80, % of those participants experience psychological or psychosomatic symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. Like 9% said it didn't bother me. That's a very small percentage of people.
And may not be representative, potentially.
Yeah. So it's like there were 534 participants in this. It was a substantial enough study. So the issues that come from this are really problematic. One of the problems with reporting this or saying this, like some people try and challenge their trolls and say, this is really hurtful, you should stop, is that a lot of the trolls get enjoyment from that. They like inflicting pain. They want to know that you're experiencing pain. So if you tell them that you're feeling anxious, depressed, worried, all these things, that's actually feeding into it and encouraging it, which is a bit of a problem. Other impacts of this are that journalists, politicians, like we said, are afraid to speak up on controversial topics or speak up where they have an opinion on something because they're more likely to be trolled or harassed when they do. And particularly female politicians and journalists speaking up about issues related to women, like anything to do with feminism is one of those topics that just provokes this kind of thing, because you've got the trolling intersecting with the manosphere and incels and all of that kind of culture, which is very vitriolic and very nihilistic anyway. So that's a problem. So it suppresses conversations that are really important to be having in our society and in our culture. It also destroys communities, like you mentioned earlier, where it's so toxic and engaged over such a long period of time, trying to distract, trying to just destroy the connections that people have with each other, that some communities just completely fall apart. What's also interesting, though, is that incivil discourse or toxic discourse can actually increase polarization and people's perception of risk. So there were a couple of really interesting studies looking at polarization and the increased perception of risk. So one of them was on the effect of like toxic discourse on people's perception of risk. And what they did was they looked at a topic like nanotechnology, which is something that people maybe don't know that much about, but have a general idea of whether they're in support of it or not. And then they exposed some people to civil discourse around it and some people to uncivil discourse around it. And they found that the people who experienced the more toxic discourse were more likely to have a higher perceived perception of risk around nanotechnology. But the mediating factor was religiosity. So it only happened for people who were more religious.
Okay.
So that sort of negative discourse combined with religiosity can increase his perceptions of risk. So if you imagine that around conversations about migration, about all sorts of things, like the kind of conversations that are happening in political discourse, along with religiosity, like look at the US and the general election over there, the presidential election over there. There's a huge amount of religiosity, very intense kind of fundamentalist religiosity,
Which
as
is
well
ironic.
as heightened polarization and perceptions of risk of trans people, migrants, people of color, liberals, everybody. The other study that I found really interesting was looking at political discourse on Reddit over a decade. So you can imagine the amount of content that they were looking at.
I was going to say, that's a massive data set.
So it was looking at political discourse within the politics subreddit, right, which is still a massive, massive data set. And what they found was increasing partisanship over time. And that increasing partisanship really influenced the civility of the political discussions that were happening. Okay. It became substantially more offensive and toxic since the presidential campaign in 2016, when Donald Trump ran for president the first time and won. What was really interesting to me is that this polarization and toxicity was not symmetric. So it wasn't both Republicans and Democrats getting equally polarized and toxic. It was primarily happening on Republican subreddits.
So where Republicans were arguing with each other, or Democrats were going into that space and arguing with Republicans?
No, Republicans arguing about Democrats, but not necessarily with Democrats.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just echo chamber.
Echo chamber, yeah. And arguing with each other as well, but it was just all of the discourse just became more toxic. So the Republicans were becoming far more extreme, and they found that as Trump rose and became more prominent, the negative partisanship also became worse and incivility increased when he was doing well in the polls. It's really interesting. What they describe as the reason for that is that Trump mainstreamed some previously fringe groups. So people like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, etc., who had previously been in the fringes in different subreddits that wouldn't have been the normal Republican subreddits, wouldn't have been welcome there, were mainstreamed and brought into those spaces. And that polarized discourse and toxic discourse came with them.
Okay.
And influenced everybody within the space, which I will talk about in a minute, how that happens. The other thing I want to talk about, the effects on people. It's not just the victims of trolling that have these effects, also the content moderators who have to look at all the reported comments and videos and so on related to trolling, as well as all the other stuff that they have to look at. This is significantly negative and very exhausting for them, emotionally exhausting for them looking at it. And actually, the more that they have to look at, the more negative comments they have to look at, which is typically what they are looking at, the more exhausted they become and the less good they get at their job.
And this is not something that can be automated either, because trolling can be quite nuanced. It
really can.
Pointed towards an individual, and you have to either have the context of how that is having an impact, or be able to read into that. And something like a learning language model or an AI tool potentially cannot do unless there's like expletives in it.
Yeah. And even then, like, a lot of what trolls will say don't often violate the community guidelines. Like, they're quite smart about how they do it. But sometimes they do and they still don't get moderated. But anyway, so yeah, it can affect content moderators as well. So we talked about what trolling is, the kind of spectrum of types of trolling, the prevalence of it. I mean, I think anyone who's been online knows that it's pretty prevalent and it's everywhere, but more so in some spaces than others. We've talked about the effects on various victims, different groups of victims. But next time, we're going to talk about why this happens and who are the trolls. So is it everyone? Is it specific types of people? What kind of people are they offline? And what can we do to stop trolling, or at least reduce trolling or protect ourselves from it? In 2 weeks' time, you will hear the second part of this episode. In the meantime, you can find us on social media, on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and Blue Sky at InBits Podcast. This episode was produced and edited by Owen Hurley, and thank you to Owen for our fantastic music as well. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.
See you in 2 weeks.